Now, when it comes to bikes and metal-framed bikes in particular, there's an endless debate over what material is the best, or more specifically, which provides the best ride feel. Now, unfortunately, the discussion often devolves into pointing out very specific properties of the materials themselves. For instance, when discussing titanium versus steel, it is true that titanium has lower density, so it is lighter than steel for the same volume of material. Titanium is also much stronger than steel in tensile yield and shear, which is why you commonly hear people reciting that titanium's strength to weight ratio is much higher than steel. Now, on the flip side, titanium is factually not as stiff as steel. In fact, it's only about half as stiff as steel, which is why titanium bike frames tend to have larger diameter tubes in order to compensate for the lower stiffness when compared to a skinny tube steel counterpart. Now, of course, these are generalized statements about the material properties of titanium and steel, and of course there's a whole slew of generalizations about aluminum frames as well. Now, bike frames are never produced from pure elemental titanium or aluminum, and believe it or not, steel isn't even an element on the periodic table. Rather, alloys or blends of elemental materials are used to produce titanium, steel, and aluminum tubing used in frame building. And for each metal, there are different available alloys, each with different material properties. So the point is that, try as we might, it's really impossible to make any generalized statements about one material over the other. Anyone who claims that a bike frame made from one metal is always more compliant or always stiffer or always lighter than another is simply not considering the whole picture. And in addition to the variation of alloys, tube diameters, and frame design from bike to bike, we haven't even mentioned the budding profiles of the individual tubes, which arguably have an equal, if not bigger, impact on the ride feel as the material itself. Now, what is for certain is that titanium is certainly more challenging to work with, which will increase production time. That, combined with the fact that titanium in its raw form is about 100 times more expensive than raw steel, typically makes a complete titanium frame substantially more expensive than a steel counterpart. So, as promised in the title, is splurging on a titanium frame actually worth it? Well, obviously no single video will hold a definitive answer, but in this video I'll share my thoughts on titanium bikes based on my experiences riding several of them over the past few years. So this is a Masi Incanto. It happens to be a titanium gravel bike that Bikes Online sent over for review, and I've been riding it around for a few weeks now. Now, it's not the first Thai bike that I've demoed, and I'm sure it won't be the last, but as far as gravel bikes go, this one is actually pretty par for the course. It's designed around 700C wheels, and the stock build comes with 40mm wide Kenda Alluvium semi-knobby tires. It comes with a SRAM Rival Explorer Access 12-speed 1x drivetrain, 40-tooth chainring up front, and a 10 to 44-tooth 12-speed cassette in the back. The geometry is also pretty standard for an all-road gravel bike, if that's even a thing. Stack of 560, reach of 384 for this size small, which is slightly longer and lower than I'm used to, but it's comfortable nonetheless. It's got a somewhat questionable head tube angle of 71.8 degrees, which seems oddly specific. The trail is 68mm, offering a balance of stability and agility. Short, relatively tucked chainstays at 425mm and a BB drop of 74mm. So basically, geometrically speaking, it's a very quote-unquote average gravel bike. Again, if that's even a thing. Nothing that stands out as odd, and it rides really predictably. Now, being a metal-framed bike, it's not a featherweight, and I have the weights for a size small demo bike on screen right now without pedals. Now, very briefly, some things that actually stand out on this bike. The fork is carbon, but it does have a kind of unique shape to it. It kind of rakes out initially and then bends back down toward the axle. Almost resembles like a Lauf fork, but without the flexi bits. Also, the photos online show a seat post with some setback, but mine came with a straight seat post, which is likely just a function of this being a size small frame. And then, of course, the real head turner are the handlebars. Now, these are the coefficient gravel handlebars. They're carbon, and they're claimed to be aero optimized, and they're just really weird. I think the idea is to create a top section with a lot of back sweep for some ergonomic benefits while not affecting the reach too much. Now, there's also convenient Garmin mount out front, and the bars are designed to be run with internal cables. For me, however, this is just an example of engineering a solution to a problem that didn't really exist and really creating some other problems along the way. For instance, the cable routing as a result of this handlebar design is pretty wild. The brake lines are routed through the handlebars, but they come out in these spots here, which actually makes the cable runs to the frame really awkward. Now, I do suppose you get that swept back top, and if that's something that you really want, then this bar could potentially work for you. Although it'd probably work best with fully internal cable routing through the stem and the head tube. Now, in my case, however, I simply had to swap the bars after a couple of rides, and I've been running an alloy Ritchie Butano bar, and I've actually been much happier with the fit. I also swapped the saddle almost immediately, but again, saddles are very personal. It's just that the stock one didn't work out for me. Okay, so other than those few quirks, the bike actually rides really nice. And again, we're discussing whether titanium as a frame material is worth the considerable investment. And so quirky component choices on a complete bike are a little bit beside the point. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ride quality. Now, I do have to say that this Masi rides very comfortably. It definitely feels lively and springy over rough terrain, very similar to some steel bikes that I've ridden in the past. And if you'll pardon the verbiage, I would have to describe the ride as damped, compliant, and muted over bumpy terrain. These are all things that I associate with a comfortable ride. Rather than pinging off rocks and roots, I almost felt as if I were sort of plowing over them with like a nice satisfying thud. So I'd say that I do feel a difference in ride quality between this Thai bike and an aluminum or steel bike, but it is really subtle. I felt the same way when I tested the Blackheart all-road Thai and aluminum bikes back to back. Like, there is definitely a difference, but you really have to focus your senses to feel it. And I also think that wide tires run at relatively low pressures plays a really significant role in the ride feel, perhaps more so than the frame material itself. Even on this Masi here, a difference between 3 or 4 psi in the tires actually makes a really big difference in ride feel. Now, what makes it even more difficult to tease out any differences in ride feel between metals is the fact that equivalent frames in different metals can't actually exist. Now, what I mean by that is you could conceive of an experiment where you ride a nice, well-designed Thai gravel bike and then transfer all the components over to another frame made from, say, steel, with everything being identical, including the geometry, the butting profiles of the tubes, the tube diameters, etc. Now, those two bikes would ride so utterly differently, there wouldn't even be a comparison. The steel version would be a tank, the tubes would be entirely overbuilt, and it would probably weigh a ton. Recall again that steel is much stiffer than titanium, so you can get away with running a much smaller diameter tube for an equivalently stiff frame. So in other words, again, it's just really hard to isolate the frame material between two frames of dissimilar metals. And ultimately, I strongly believe that the frame design, as in geometry, butting profile, tubing diameter, has a lot greater influence on the ride feel than the material itself. Now, fortunately, this Masi Incanto was designed in such a way that all the positive properties of titanium do tend to stand out. Again, it does feel springy and lively, but I've also ridden many bikes that have similar ride characteristics that are not Thai. For instance, the Ritchie Outback has a similar ride feel with its butted steel logic tubing, noting of course that the tube diameters are substantially smaller than on the Incanto. So if I had to make a generalized sweeping observation about Thai frames, I might say that when compared to steel, Thai has a slightly, we'll say, tighter feel to it. As in, it does tend to mute road buzz, but in a slightly stiffer and less damped way. Now, I have no data to back this up, but of the handful of Thai bikes that I've ridden, I've generally felt that they ride similar to steel, but perhaps not quite as damped in how they dissipate vibrational energy. Now, again, this could easily just be a perceived property based on my own unique experiences, but nonetheless, what's generally always true is that the difference in ride feel is always pretty subtle. And again, with the trend of wider, squishier tires run at lower pressures, those differences become even more difficult to tease out. So, what was the title of this video? Right, are titanium bikes, and specifically Thai gravel bikes in this context, worth it? Well, I said earlier that no single video is going to have a definitive answer, but if you want titanium for the sake of the alleged improvement in ride feel, as in buttery smooth, springy, damped, muted, all those adjectives, then I'll go ahead and say outright that no, the price jump to get on a nice Thai frame is just not going to be worth it. I know. It's a hot take. But I will be the first to admit that ride feel isn't everything when it comes to selecting a frame material. People who invest in titanium often do so knowing that a nice steel counterpart would probably ride equally well and cost about half as much. But they go for the tie frame anyways for a number of other reasons. One of which is that titanium is extremely corrosion resistant, which is why most titanium bikes that you see are just a raw brushed finish. Steel, on the other hand, unless it's stainless, is highly susceptible to rust and other types of corrosion. Now, it's possible that some people may believe that a high-end tie frame is somehow necessarily lighter than a high-end steel frame, but again, that's not actually true. Recall, because tie is not as stiff as steel, larger diameter tubing has to be used to produce the same overall stiffness. So weight is often a wash between tie and steel. And then, of course, the elephant in the room, it could just be the bling factor. Having a tie bike really does tend to set you apart from the crowd and lets everybody know that you're a committed, lifelong cyclist and that you're willing to drop big bucks on your gear. The vanity of it is something that we don't like to admit, but deep down, if you're a cyclist, you've got at least some amount of pride in the aesthetic of your bike. And buying a tie frame could just be some kind of manifestation of that. Anyways, my answer to the question, are tie bikes worth it, is going to be a likely upsetting, it depends. If you're looking for pure ride feel, then no, tie is definitely not going to be worth the price, but there are plenty of other reasons that investing in titanium might be worth it to you. Now, what I'd like to hear are your thoughts on titanium as a frame material. Is it always worth it, or does it depend? What are the reasons besides ride feel that you would opt to shell out for a tie frame? Let us know down below. I'm legitimately curious to know your thoughts. All right, well, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.